Gameplay in action RPG video games is a crucial aspect of the whole experience. It is what you'll be doing for most of the video game. Story and systems are important, but you will always be experiencing the gameplay as you play through the game. While there are many different aspects of the gameplay experience like combat, movement, exploration, world interaction, keybinds, and more, for this video I'm going to take a look into the three more important ones: combat, movement, and world interaction. These three aspects have to be spot on when making an action RPG video game. If the focus of your game is to have impactful moment-to-moment combat sequences where each split-second action matters, and making sure that each weapon looks and sounds as it should is very important. If you're using a katana, then you should be able to hear and see each slash as it passes through the enemy. Each move you make needs to be calculated. Taking one wrong step could lead to disaster, and the world needs to be designed in tandem with the movement to make it feel like every move you make was designed to be made and used specifically in this world. The greatest example in recent times of a game that does this perfectly would be Elden Ring. Every weapon sounds and feels as it should. Swords, greatswords, bows, and spells, all of them feel and sound as they should. The world is designed for the player to need to calculate every single step, because one wrong step could lead to your downfall. This level of detail is expected of games that want to focus on the moment-to-moment, one-on-one interactions. The near opposite is the case for Genshin and Honkai Impact. These two games focus on two different aspects of gameplay. The first half is on the team building and the synergy between all the characters in the party, figuring out the best team composition, what each character provides to the party, and what weapon and equipment each character needs to provide the most that they can. The second half is then entering combat with your chosen party, using their skills, bursts, passive, and elemental reactions effectively and synergistically to beat your opponent. Genshin and Honkai have you compare characters of similar style or benefits and outweigh the pros and cons of both of them to determine which character will provide the best results to your party. Then put yourself against enemies to see if you can beat them. But both games do this slightly differently from each other. So let's take a look at how Genshin Impact does this first. Genshin Impact has you create a party of any 4 characters you own. Each character is one of 7 elements: Anemo, Geo, Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, Electro, and/or Dendro. Each element has a place in the game, but naturally some will be stronger than others. Each character can also use one of 5 different weapon types: sword, claymore, spear, bow, and catalyst. Weapons play a slightly minor role as it depends on what playstyle you like using, but some weapon types like sword and spear have a very strong weapon choice. Different characters fill different roles, from main damage dealers like Hu Tao and Ayato to damage supporters like Bennett and Kazuha, and healers like Barbara and Sayu, with there being a few hybrid type characters like Zhongli, a tank damage support, and Kokomi, a main healer damage dealer. Your first step is to pick your characters. Your party will generally have 1 main damage dealer, 2 damage supporters, and 1 healer. When picking your characters, there are a few things you need to consider. Firstly, you'll need to consider element type, as there are elemental resonances that are party-wide bonuses depending on which resonance you have. Elemental reactions need to be thought about, as some elemental reactions can change the power of your party drastically, like Superconduct in a Eula team. Here is a list of all the reactions. On the left you have amplification reactions, which consist of only Hydro, Pyro, and Cryo reactions, which can either give you a 1.5 damage bonus or a 2 times damage bonus depending on which element is the reactor, as well as scale with almost all stats in the game depending on which character you're playing. And on the right you have transformative reactions. These reactions include all the Electro, Anemo, and Geo reactions, and generally speaking are static numbers. And this is because these reactions scale only with 2 things: the character level and the character's elemental mastery. While transformative reactions don't bring massive numbers, they bring extra effects. Reacting Electro and Cryo will cause Superconduct, decreasing enemy physical resistance. Hydro and Electro will cause Supercharge, staggering enemies occasionally. Considering which reactions you need to bring out the most of your main DPS is another crucial step in building your party in Genshin Impact. Will you go for a single target massive pyro reaction build, or will you choose mass area of effect damage with swirl reactions? After choosing your characters, you then have to choose the correct weapon and artifacts for that character. Weapons in a general sense follow the line of what you have available to you, because for the most part all weapons are from the gacha. An easy way to look at it is the higher the rarity, the better it is. If you are still unsure, just use a crit rate weapon, they're the best. The artifacts though is where Genshin goes deep. Genshin is a heavily statistical game. You have many stats to consider: attack, defense, HP, elemental mastery, energy recharge, crit rate, and crit damage. Each one of these can play a part in building a character. Some characters are as simple as stack attack percent like Diluc, or some can be complex like energy recharge, crit rate, crit damage management on Raiden Shogun. The artifacts is where you'll be doing most of your power gain, as having attack percent versus HP percent major on a piece can provide an astronomical difference in damage. So after creating your team and building them, it's time to enter combat. Genshin Impact's combat is very much centered around the many different elemental reactions that can occur very quickly and unexpectedly in the middle of combat. Knowing which enemies are affected with which element is important, so you can plan your next elemental attack and cause the correct reaction to do immense damage. The spectrum of combat gameplay in Genshin is very large. The lowest end tends to be a party of random characters, usually a person's favorites. These characters sometimes aren't synergistical and all elemental skills and bursts are used whenever possible. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have the macro management, co-op assistance to use 6 characters in total, metronomes, time tickings, and perfectly timed skill and burst usage with elemental application rates. Both of these playstyles and everything in between is 100% viable and can get you far in Genshin. That though is mainly because the game is very easy, but that's a topic for a different video. To go into a few specifics, a general Genshin encounter can go like this. You encounter some enemies, you see what type of enemies they are, assess if they are normal or elemental enemies. If they are normal, defeat in whatever way you so choose. If elemental, use effective attacks against them as they can have some resistances or even in some cases immunities. If you see a pyro shield, use hydro characters to remove it. If you see cryo shields, use pyro attacks to remove it. Genshin's core gameplay can be easily summarized as build your team so that you can deal with a variety of enemies unless you know what enemies you will encounter. Unless you know exactly what enemies you will be fighting in the next encounter, build your team to cover a lot of bases. Have elemental variety so you can deal with unexpected situations. Honkai Impact follows a similar style but has some massive differences in specific areas. So let's take a deep dive into the gameplay of Honkai Impact. Honkai has you create a party of 3 characters instead of 4, with one of them being the leader that provides a team-wide buff, much like the elemental resonances. Each character has their own leader ability that can be applied to the party, so choose carefully who you place as number 1 in your team. The 2 other characters just fill the role of a switchable teammate. Each character can be one of 5 different types, and for those who don't know, this is an elemental triangle or a counter triangle. Each character can be one of these types: psychic, mecha, biologic, imaginary, or quantum. Psychic beats mecha, mecha beats biologic, and biologic beats psychic. And the last 2, imaginary and quantum characters, beat themselves, but not each other. And to find out what type each character is, just look at their portrait background, and the color of the background corresponds to the type that they are. And as for the enemies, you can do the same when going into a stage. You'll get a summary of what enemies you'll be fighting and what type they are. But that isn't the last step. In fact, it's one of 3 steps to consider when creating your party. The second step is to know what element that character uses and what element is best in the situations. Characters can be one of 4 different elements: physical, fire, ice, and lightning. The elements play a less impactful role than the types of characters, but certain situations may call for specific elements to be used, like the universal mirage, which greatly increases one specific element's damage and greatly reduces all other elements. But once you figure out what element you either need or want to use, you can now move on to considering step 3 of 3, which is what weapon do you want to use? There are many weapon types in Honkai Impact: pistols, katanas, cannons, crosses, greatswords, gauntlets, scythes, lances, bows, and chakrams, and I have no doubt they will be adding more. The slightly limiting factor is that specific character models can only use one weapon type. For example, all Kianas use pistols, all Bronyas use cannons, and all Meis use katanas. And while this may be a limiting factor, it is heavily alleviated by the sheer difference in gameplay between 2 models of the same character. Shadow Dash Mei will be substantially different to Herstra of Thunder Mei, even though they are the same character and use the same weapon type. But in the end, choice of weapon style is near insignificant in the long run. There is technically one more step to consider when choosing your character, and it's to find out what debuff they can apply to the enemies. Honkai has a fair few debuffs, and some enemies in the game become astronomically easier when using the right one. For example, impairing an enemy with high physical resistance can make the fight a lot easier, as impair reduces physical resistance, or in general reduces defense, which is physical resistance. This is a bit more of an in-depth topic, so I won't dwell on it for too long. Honkai Impact has made it very easy to find what characters can apply what debuff, what the debuff actually does, and what abilities on the characters apply said debuff. And this is all done through the in-game sorting function, which is extremely useful. So consider this as well when creating your team. Now that you chose your characters, you can go on to build them. Pick their best weapon and stigmata, as well as leveling up their talents. You may be wondering, what is the best weapon overall for each style that I can use on everything? Well, the answer isn't as simple as that. Unlike Genshin, where one weapon can be best in slot across many characters, Honkai has many characters, each one with their own unique weapon that is built around their playstyle and specific to them. For example, 2 new characters, Aponia and Partafelis, both use the chakram weapon style. Both characters have their own unique chakram that works with them. Aponia has the Lost Conviction, whilst Pardafelis has the Piranha Phantasma, and that's how it works for most characters. Choosing your Stigmatas is another step though, and for this one you are going to have to read a lot. Each Stigmata and all of its pieces, the top, the middle, and the bottom, have unique effects and buffs that can turn the tide of battle. So read carefully to see how it affects the party. Some characters have specific stigmatas that are unique to them, like Aponia, who uses all of the Xeno pieces. But some characters take a mix of different ones, so read carefully to find out what's best, or just look up a guide. Now that those two things are done, now you just have to level everything up, your characters, weapons, stigmata, and talents, and you're good to go to combat. Now, speaking of combat, Honkai Impact's combat is combo based. You have to know the attack sequence, when to tap attack or when to hold attack. Some characters have it easier than others, whilst others have it much harder. Look at Aponia for example, a rather easy character I would say. You just press attack repeatedly for a long time and you'll pretty much just win with her. While for the Fu Hua characters, you need to know the combos. You need to know if it's a 3 attack and a hold, or is it a 5 attack and 2 ultimate taps. Pausing the game mid-level and going to the input tab tells you all the combos for your characters. So you don't need to worry about testing and trialing, you can just go to that menu and learn all the combos. On top of this, you also have weapon skills and ultimates to consider when fighting enemies, and these are pretty much the same as Genshin Impact. Fighting enemies only using combos, skills, and ultimates is fine and dandy, but switching between characters and using different abilities from all 3 different units is also rather important. QTE exists as a means to switch between characters and gain a lot of value either in damage or some sort of extra buff effect. QTE can be triggered on different characters in different ways. Most characters trigger it with a time fracture, which is caused by a perfect evasion or perfect dodge, and some characters have specific ways to trigger it which range from using weapon skill or to applying status effects. The same skill spectrum applies to Honkai that was applied to Genshin Impact. The lower echelon of players play the game in a very chillax manner, using the buttons as they see fit or become available, while the upper echelon of players also consists of tick timing, metronome counting, and in general a min-maxing of the absolute extreme. And this is pretty much all to do with Honkai's gameplay. So let's compare and contrast the similarities and the differences. Both games are super in-depth about the creation of your team, the equipping of gear and stat management, and the fluid and rhythmic combat. Picking your characters in Genshin is rather straightforward, as there has been a meta for a long time that hasn't changed. Bennett. Bennett! And all DPS characters are viable because the game hasn't become much more difficult, while in Honkai, power creep is most certainly a thing. Older characters are just fundamentally weaker than the new characters, but to me, that is alleviated by the fact that getting characters is much easier in Honkai than in Genshin Impact, because you can buy some from the shops and the gacha is a fair bit more generous than Genshin Impact's. Building your characters in both games is pretty much the same. Equip a weapon and stigmatas for Honkai or artifacts for Genshin Impact. The only notable difference is that Honkai has unique weapons for its characters that actually play to the style of that character, while Genshin has more general weapons that can be used on everyone. Artifacts and stigmata are identical, the only difference is that stigmata are much easier to get. The combat is where the games differ greatly. Both games are very in-depth in their combat system, but Genshin goes the route of elemental reactions and timing a burst correctly to be able to either cause many small reactions or one very large reaction, while Honkai goes down the route of combo-based combat, where each character's specific attack input matters, debuffing enemies and switching between characters with QTE at precise times. Gameplay in both games is phenomenal, and which one you enjoy depends on you. Do you like acquiring and building of your characters to be very RNG heavy and streamlined in terms of weapons, but have a very in-depth elemental reaction system with 7 different elements? Or do you like the very grindy method of acquiring and building your characters where each character has their specific weapons, but a very combo-centric combat system with heavy emphasis on debuffing and switching between different characters? Tell me down in the comments. I personally believe both games have gameplay beyond belief for a free-to-play market and even the mobile market. But for me personally, Honkai Impact is slightly more enjoyable overall, specifically in the building your characters portion of gameplay. So for this video, I'm going to say that Honkai takes the win because the farming of artifacts in Genshin Impact is worse than death itself. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy the Genshin vs Honkai series, then hit the like button to tell me, or write down in the comments what you think about it. Also tell me in the comments what do you think of both the games and their gameplay systems, and which do you prefer. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.